The mysterious visitorite was an unusually brisk evening in late autumn when the visitor arrived at our Baker Street address. And yet, I could never have known the true chill that would settle over me in the coming days. The gas lamps outside flickered, casting long shadows against the walls of our modest apartment. Holmes, as usual, was seated at his desk, idly twirling his violin bow between his fingers, seemingly lost in thought. I, for my part, had been attempting to focus on a medical journal, but my thoughts were far from the pages before me. Holmes had been quieter than usual, as if his mind were preoccupied with some distant problem only he could see. Chapter 1. I had long grown accustomed to these periods of silence in Holmes' company. His thoughts, often tumultuous and shifting in ways I could scarcely follow, demanded a form of mental isolation I could never truly penetrate. As his loyal chronicler, I had learned to read the subtle signs, his furrowed brow, the peculiar way his eyes darted from one object to another as though searching for something elusivate. I knew that when Holmes became quiet, something of immense importance was brewing in that restless mind of his. Yet, on that particular evening, I felt an unusual tension in the air, an almost imperceptible hum that seemed to charge the space around us. Little did I know, the evening would soon reveal the source of that unease. The knock came sharply, echoing through the thin walls of our apartment, and for a moment I felt a peculiar shiver down my spine. The interruption was so sudden that Holmes, who was always attuned to such sounds, did not stir. He remained perfectly still, his gaze never leaving the violin bow as he continued to twist it between his fingers, as though waiting for something just beyond the door to pull him into action. "Watson," he said, without raising his voice, his eyes flicking toward me for the first time, "would you be so kind as to see who our visitor is? It seems we are to be drawn into yet another puzzle." I glanced at him, perplexed. He had not moved, his expression unchanged. But I knew better than to question his foresight, so I rose from my chair and made my way to the door. The visitor's knock had not been hurried or urgent, but the firm manner in which it had sounded suggested a purpose, a definite intent to be let in. As I opened the door, I found myself face to face with a tall man whose presence seemed to fill the entire threshold. He was dressed in a dark overcoat that reached down to his knees, its fabric weathered from long use but of fine make. His face was partially obscured by a high collar, and a wide-brimmed hat that appeared to be far too large for him was pulled low, casting shadows across his features. Despite his attempt to shield his identity, his eyes were unmistakable, dark, intense, and filled with a frenetic energy that suggested he was not merely a man of urgent business, but one on the verge of desperation. His eyes flickered nervously, darting from side to side, as though scanning the shadows for an unseen presence. He stepped into the room without waiting for an invitation, his footsteps heavy on the creaking floorboards as he made his way further inside. "Dr. Watson," he asked, his voice hoarse, strained, as if it had been overused. "I've come to speak with Mr. Sherlock Holmes." "Indeed, you have found him," I replied, motioning for him to step further into the room. His manner was unmistakably that of someone who had been running, or perhaps hiding, from something. His hurried breath, the wild look in his eyes, and the anxious movements of his hands all told me more than I cared to know about his state of mind. "And you are Henry Mayhew," the man said, shaking off his coat with a quick, jerky motion. He removed his hat and ran a hand through his prematurely graying hair, which was as disheveled as the rest of him. "I am in dire need of Mr. Holmes' services." At the mention of Holmes' name, the man's gaze shifted toward the desk, and though Holmes remained seated with his back to us, I could see a flicker of interest in his posture. He turned his head just slightly, his sharp eyes narrowing as he surveyed Mayhew with the meticulous observation I had come to expect from him. "Mr. Mayhew," Holmes said, his voice calm and measured, You are not here by accident. You have come seeking something, though I suspect it is not merely a case of ordinary distress. Please, share the nature of your problem." Mayhew hesitated for a moment, as though he were unsure how to begin. His hands trembled slightly, and his lips pressed together in a tight line as he seemed to gather his thoughts. After a moment, he began speaking again, his voice low and hushed, as though he feared someone outside might overhear him. "It is a matter of life and death, Mr. Holmes," he began. "I am a surgeon, or was, until recently. I practice well at. It's no longer my own." Holmes' expression did not change, but I could see his attention sharpen. The mention of surgery piqued his interest. It was a subject Holmes knew well, having observed me in my own medical practice on countless occasions. Still, there was something in Mayhew's words that suggested deeper currents, hidden truth he was not yet ready to reveal. A week ago, I was called to the home of a wealthy client, Lord Wentworth. Mayhew continued. He had been suffering from a grave condition, one that I am not at liberty to discuss in detail, but suffice it to say, it required immediate and delicate surgery. After I performed the procedure, I received a payment of a most generous sum. With a peculiar condition, I was to leave the premises and never return. I had no reason to question it at the time, but soon after, I began receiving threats, strange letters, warnings that I was being watched, that I had made a grave mistake. Holmes was now standing, pacing slowly, his long, lean form moving with deliberate steps. His eyes never left Mayhew, studying every twitch, every flicker of discomfort that betrayed the man's anxious state. I had learned long ago that Holmes was never moved by the drama of a situation. His mind worked on an entirely different plane, far above emotional response. He was calculating, always assessing, and now asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. "You say you are being accused of Lord Wentworth's murder. How did he die?" Mayhew's eyes darkened, and his voice became tinged with both grief and frustration. "It was a surgical error, or so they say. The wound I treated became infected, and within days, he was dead. But I was not at fault. I have never been." Holmes stopped pacing abruptly and turned to face Mayhew directly. His eyes narrowed as he took in every detail of the man's expression. I could see that Holmes was already making mental notes, piecing together the fragments of the story that Mayhew had revealed so far. But Holmes kept his cards close to his chest, as always, never showing the full extent of his thoughts. "You are certain of your innocence, then?" Holmes asked, his tone now colder, more probing. "Absolutely," Mayhew replied, his voice rising in pitch with the intensity of his denial. "But I am not the only one who knows this. Tease, there are others who seek to frame me for a crime I did not commit. In the circumstances of Lord Wentworth's death," I pressed, eager for more details. "How did it come to pass that his condition worsened so quickly?" Mayhew's face twisted with frustration. "It should not have happened. I have seen many cases like his, and while his condition was severe, it was manageable. I performed the surgery with the utmost care, but there were others involved in his care after I left. The family kept to themselves, and I was told that I need not return. I had no further involvement, but now I am being made the scapegoat." Holmes was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Mayhew with an intensity that seemed to burn through the man's defenses. Finally, he spoke. "We shall go to Lord Wentworth's estate," Holmes said, his voice calm but commanding. "It's a game is afoot." As we gathered our coats and prepared to leave, I could not shake the feeling that something about this case was not as it seemed. Mayhew's story, though tragic, felt incomplete, as though he were omitting some crucial detail. Holmes, I knew, would waste no time in unraveling this mystery, and I, as always, would follow along, though I had no idea just how deep the rabbit hole would go. The night outside was dark, and a fog rolled in from the Thames, thick and suffocating. The gas lamps cast weak glows, their light fading into the mist, creating an eerie atmosphere as we stepped into the cab awaiting us outside. Holmes seemed lost in thought, and I, too, found my mind wandering as we made our way toward the estate. I could feel the tension building within me, but I could not yet see the full picture. What was Lord Wentworth hiding? And what part did Mayhew play in this deadly game? The consultation, the cab rattled through the winding streets of London, its wheels clattering over the cobblestones as the fog thickened around us. Holmes remained in his usual state of quiet contemplation, his sharp gaze scanning the surroundings, though his mind was elsewhere entirely. I, on the other hand, was consumed by the questions that swirled in my own mind. Henry Mayhew's tale was compelling, certainly, but the more I thought about it, the more I was struck by an uneasy feeling. There were gaps in his story, small omissions that seemed deliberate, as though he were holding back critical information. Holmes had not yet spoken of his own thoughts on the matter, and I knew better than to press him for answers. His silence spoke volumes, and I trusted that, when he was ready, he would reveal his conclusions. We arrived at Lord Wentworth's estate shortly before midnight. The grand manor loomed in the distance, its stone facade shrouded in mist, casting an eerie silhouette against the inky sky. The imposing iron gates creaked as they swung open to admit us, the gravel drive crunching beneath the wheels of the cab. As we approached the house, the lanterns flickered dimly, adding an almost spectral quality to the scene. A chill ran down my spine, but I quickly dismissed it, attributing it to the dampness of the night. Holmes instructed the driver to wait and, with an almost unnatural sense of calm, led the way to the entrance. The door was opened by a butler tall, stoic, and decidedly unfazed by our late arrival. He bowed politely, his face as impassive as the mansion itself. "Good evening, gentlemen. Lord Wentworth is expecting you," he said in a low, even voice, though his eyes flickered with a hint of unease that I could not ignore. "Lead the way," Holmes said with a quiet assurance, and we followed the butler through the dimly lit halls of the manor. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and fading perfume, the very atmosphere of the house seeming to whisper of secrets long buried as we made our way deeper into the estate. I couldn't help but feel the weight of the house's history pressing down on us. The grandiose portraits that lined the walls seemed to stare down with silent judgment, and the thick tapestries that adorned the corridors swayed gently as though the very fabric of the house were alive. Watching us as we passed, the butler led us into a drawing room where a fire burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. A single lamp illuminated the otherwise dim room, and I was immediately struck by the opulence of the surroundings. The furniture, though elegant, bore the unmistakable signs of age, and the decor, while grand, seemed to have lost its luster over the years. Yet it was not the furnishings that caught my attention. It was the figure sitting in the corner of the room. A man, older than I had expected, sat in a high-backed chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His appearance was almost skeletal, his face gaunt and hollowed, and his eyes dark, sunken, and filled with an unsettling intensity fixed on the fire before him. The butler's presence seemed to make the man tense, but he did not move, nor did he acknowledge us in any way. I could only assume this was Lord Wentworth himself. "Lord Wentworth," the butler began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson have arrived." The man did not respond immediately, but after a long pause, he slowly turned his head to regard us. His gaze was calculating, as if weighing us both before allowing himself to speak. "Sherlock Holmes, I presume," Lord Wentworth said in a voice that was surprisingly steady, given his fragile appearance. "You've come to investigate my family's troubles, I take it." Holmes, with a grace that always seemed to surprise me, stepped forward and offered a bow. "Indeed, my lord, seems we have much to discuss." Lord Wentworth's lips tightened as though he were about to speak again, but instead, he motioned for us to take a seat. "Please, take a seat. I trust your journey was not too difficult." The conversation was cordial, but the tension in the air was palpable. Mayhew had warned us of a strained atmosphere, and it seemed that his account had been accurate. There was something in Wentworth's eyes, something hidden beneath the surface that I could not quite place. It was not grief or sorrow that weighed on him, but a cold, calculating awareness of the situation. "Mr. Holmes, I understand you are here on behalf of Dr. Mayhew," Lord Wentworth began, his voice low. "You've come to learn the truth of what happened to my son. It was, after all, my responsibility." Holmes remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on Lord Wentworth, as though he were probing the man's every word. Finally, he spoke. "Your son, my lord, was in Dr. Mayhew's care," Holmes said, his tone measured, but with an undercurrent of something sharper, something that only I could detect. "But it seems that there is more to this story than mere medical malpractice, is there not?" Lord Wentworth stiffened slightly at the mention of his son, his lips curling into a thin, almost imperceptible smile. "I am not entirely sure what you mean, Mr. Holmes. My son was a man of great intellect and ambition, but his life was cut short due to unforeseen complications. The death of my son is not a matter of murder, it is a matter of medical error." Holmes' expression remained inscrutable, but I could see his mind working, his sharp eyes flicking over Lord Wentworth's every movement, every twitch of his hand. He was calculating something, piecing together a puzzle that I could not yet see. I had learned long ago that Holmes never revealed his conclusions too early. He was far more interested in the game than in the answer, and every word spoken by Lord Wentworth seemed to be another piece of the puzzle. "The circumstances surrounding your son's death are, as you say, tragic, my lord," Holmes said finally, his voice unwavering. "But there are things that do not add up. Have spoken with Dr. Mayhew, and his account of the events that led to your son's death raises more questions than answers." Lord Wentworth's eyes flickered with something that was not grief, but a hint of fear. He quickly masked it, but I saw it, and I knew Holmes had seen it too. "Dr. Mayhew's account," Wentworth repeated, his voice laced with cold amusement. "Mr. Holmes, you must understand that Dr. Mayhew is a man in distress. His situation is, shall we say, less than reliable. He is desperate to clear his name, and in his desperation, he may have distorted the truth." Holmes' gaze never wavered, and I could feel the subtle tension between them growing. The air in the room seemed to thicken, as though every word spoken carried a weight that might tip the balance in one direction or another. "Perhaps," Holmes replied coolly, "but I believe there is more to this story than either Dr. Mayhew or yourself are telling me, and it is my job to find the truth." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension. Lord Wentworth's gaze was locked on Holmes, and for a moment it seemed as though time had stopped in that small, dimly lit room. I could feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on us all, but I knew, as I always did when Holmes was involved, that the truth would eventually be revealed. But for now, all we had were questions and one very elusive answer. Chapter 2, Asterisk, the early investigation. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, sending little bursts of light across the room, casting fleeting shadows on the faces of those present. Lord Wentworth had grown more distant after his words, retreating into the heavy silence that now hung over the drawing room. Holmes, ever perceptive, had continued to study the older man with a concentration that left no detail unexamined. His Sharp eyes flickered from Wentworth's posture to the subtle tension in his face, but Holmes said little more. Instead, he simply continued to observe, letting the silence stretch on. I, on the other hand, had been growing increasingly uneasy. Every moment we spent within the confines of Wentworth's manor only deepened the suspicion that something far darker than medical error was at play. Lord Wentworth's calculated dismissals of Dr. Mayhew's account had only served to deepen the mystery. There was an intentional obfuscation in his manner, as if he feared something more than the death of his son. Holmes, sensing my growing restlessness, turned to me with an almost imperceptible gesture. He was ready to leave the drawing room. I nodded in response, knowing we needed to begin our investigation in earnest if we were to make any headway in this case. Lord Wentworth, Holmes began, his voice smooth, polite, but firm. If you will excuse us, we should like to take a closer look at your son's private chambers. I believe there may be more to this story than can be found here. Wentworth's expression faltered for a brief moment, his fingers twitching as though he might protest, but instead he nodded stiffly. Very well, he said, his voice tight. Do not waste time. My son's belongings are of little importance now. I saw a fleeting moment of discomfort pass through his face, but as quickly as it appeared, he masked it with a studied calm. I will have the servants guide you, he added, before turning away and retreating toward the fire, leaving us with the butler once again. The butler led us up a grand staircase that creaked beneath our weight as we ascended. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, its imposing walls closing in as though we were intruders in a place that had long forgotten its purpose. At the top of the staircase, the butler paused in front of a set of double doors, each adorned with intricate carvings that appeared to be centuries old. Master Wentworth's son's room is through here, he said, pushing one of the doors open with a quiet groan. Please, gentlemen, take care. The room we entered was opulent but cold, its grandeur muted by the heavy atmosphere of a life cut short. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the pale light of the moon. A large four-poster bed sat at the center of the room, its ornate posts carved from dark mahogany, but there was an emptiness to the space and absence of warmth or comfort. Everything was pristine, untouched since the day of the death. The air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and dust, as though the room had been frozen in time. Frozen in time. Holmes moved with a grace that belied his sharp scrutiny. His keen eyes swept across the room, taking in every detail with the precision of a seasoned investigator. I, too, began to scan the room, but it was Holmes' every movement that seemed to carry meaning. He approached the desk first, his fingers brushing over the leather-bound books and papers that littered its surface. This is where Lord Wentworth's son must have spent much of his time, Holmes remarked quietly. Man of intellect, one who likely had his own ambitions, yet I see no sign of any unfinished work. His notes, if any existed, are curiously absent. Kai nodded, noting the emptiness of the room. Perhaps Lord Wentworth took them, I suggested, my voice echoing in the silence. Holmes' eyes flicked toward me. Perhaps, he said, though his tone suggested that this was not his preferred theory. He turned to the bookshelf, pulling a volume from its place without hesitation. As he flipped through its pages, his fingers danced over the text, pausing at a page halfway through the book. A journal, he said. It would appear to have been hastily abandoned. The handwriting is unmistakable. This is indeed the hand of Wentworth's son. But the last entry, he paused, reading aloud the few lines scrawled at the bottom of the page. I have found the key. The truth lies beneath. I felt a surge of anticipation as I stepped closer to peer over Holmes' shoulder. The words were cryptic, enigmatic, but there was no mistaking the urgency they conveyed. The mention of a key and the truth beneath sent a shiver of realization through me. Was this a clue? Had Wentworth's son discovered something that his father was now hiding? Holmes closed the journal with a snap, his expression now distant, as though he were considering all the possibilities in one fleeting moment. He looked toward me. "We must find that key," he said, his voice firm with intent. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. We had uncovered a thread, but it was only the beginning. The real question, however, was where to. Look next. Holmes was already in motion, scanning the room for any signs that might lead us to the key the journal spoke of. I watched him, fascinated, as always, by his methodical approach. He checked the drawers of the desk, moved to the bed to inspect the sheets and linens with a meticulousness that seemed excessive at first, but was always rewarded in the end. A small wooden box caught his attention. It was tucked away beneath the bed, half hidden in the shadow cast by the four-poster frame. He knelt to inspect it closely, then gave a sharp nod of approval before retrieving it. "I believe this is the key," Holmes muttered, more to himself than to me. His fingers worked quickly, sliding open the lid with a deft motion. Inside was a collection of small, delicate objects, perhaps trinkets or keepsakes, alongside a tightly folded letter. Holmes extracted the letter first, his brow furrowing as he unfolded the paper and began to read. The letter was brief, but the words burned with a sense of purpose. "I will expose the truth, no matter the cost. The surgeon's final stitch will be the last." Holmes' lips curled into a smile, but it was not one of satisfaction. It was a smile that hinted at deeper knowledge, a sign that Holmes had connected the dots in a way that left me still grappling with the enormity of the situation. "This changes everything," Holmes muttered. "A coup. We are dealing with something far more complicated than a simple case of medical negligence. The surgeon's final stitch. Whodunit is a metaphor. It suggests that someone is hiding something critical, something that could unravel the entire situation." I watched as Holmes folded the letter carefully, his expression one of quiet determination. "We must return to the family. The truth, I believe, lies within the very house we stand in." As we made our way back to the drawing room, my mind raced with the implications of what we had discovered. The letter, the cryptic warning, what had Wentworth's son uncovered. Okay, and what was this final stitch he referred to? The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but I knew that Holmes was not yet finished. His brilliant mind had only just begun to untangle the web that bound Lord Wentworth to his son's death. Chapter 3A. Buried clue. The following morning arrived with a persistent mist that seemed to have wrapped itself around the entire estate. The heavy fog had not lifted, and the manor felt more isolated than ever, as if it were adrift in a sea of uncertainty. Inside, however, the atmosphere was tense in a different way. Lord Wentworth had left us alone in the drawing room, his retreating footsteps leaving an eerie silence behind him. Holmes, ever the master of patience, did not rush to speak. Instead, he stood by the window, his gaze distant as he pondered the situation. I, too, was consumed by the events of the previous night. Holmes had made his first bold theory, but I knew it was only the beginning. We had not yet uncovered the full extent of the mystery, nor had we identified the true culprits. Holmes' words had struck a chord within me, but I could not fully grasp the breadth of the conspiracy he seemed to be hinting at. Something about Wentworth's family dealings, something buried beneath the surface, still eluded me. "It's clear that Lord Wentworth has been involved in some form of deception," Holmes said finally, turning from the window to face me. "But his role, though significant, is not the only one. There are others in play, individuals with motivations we have yet to fully understand." I nodded, feeling the weight of the investigation settle around me once again. "You believe his son uncovered something important? But what, precisely, was it?" Holmes glanced at the journal we had taken from Wentworth's son's chambers, which now lay open on the table between us. "The answer lies in this journal, Watson," he said, his voice low but resolute. I believe that it holds the key to understanding exactly what his son discovered. He reached for the journal, flipping through the pages with a deftness that came from years of practice. His eyes moved quickly, absorbing the details with an intensity that I could never replicate. He paused, however, when he reached a particular entry, one that had not stood out to me at first, but now seemed to pause with significance. Holmes' fingers hovered over the page, tracing the letters as though he were reading between the lines. This entry, he said quietly, was written shortly before his death. It contains a warning, one that, at first glance, seems nonsensical. I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. Holmes read aloud, his voice soft as he quoted the words from the journal. The last stitch is a thread that ties the truth to the heart of the house. Seek the hidden door, for it is there that the answer lies. I frowned, the cryptic words swirling in my mind. A hidden door. What could he have meant by that? Holmes closed the journal with a snap, his expression unreadable. The answer, Watson, lies in the structure of this house itself. The hidden door is not a metaphor, it's a physical place, a compartment perhaps, that has been concealed for years. I stood up, walking to the center of the room. My mind raced as I considered the possibilities. A hidden compartment, a secret doorway, all seemed too fantastical, too convoluted. And yet, I had seen Holmes uncover such things before, places where secrets were buried, waiting to be uncovered by those who knew where to look. We need to search this house more thoroughly, Holmes said, his voice firm. If Wentworth's son found something, it's likely hidden somewhere within these walls. I hesitated for a moment, unsure where to begin. But where, Holmes? The estate is vast. We could spend days combing through it. Holmes smiled faintly, as though he had anticipated my concern. Not days, Watson. We start with the things most people would overlook, the places where one might hide something of great importance, something that requires both access and secrecy. We made our way to the upper floors of the manor, where the true architecture of the estate seemed more intricate, more layered. The servants' quarters were tucked away in the farthest corners of the building, but we bypassed them, heading toward areas that appeared to have been untouched for decades. There was an unsettling quiet in these parts of the house rooms, sealed off by time, their doors locked and rarely opened. It was in these forgotten spaces that I believed we would find the answers we sought. Holmes moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the walls, the floors, even the ceilings. Every detail was scrutinized with the precision of a man who could find meaning in the smallest of clues. He paused before an old wooden panel in the hallway, its grain worn with age, but otherwise unremarkable. His fingers brushed lightly over its surface, and I could see a flicker of recognition in his gaze. "This is it," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. A hidden door, just as the journal described. I stepped closer, my heart racing as Holmes began to work at the edges of the panel. It was difficult to tell at first, but as he pressed against the wood, a faint sound echoed from behind it, a soft creaking, as though the door had not been opened in years. Holmes' fingers worked swiftly, sliding a small knife from his pocket and using it to pry the panel away from its frame. With a soft click, the door swung open, revealing a narrow passage that led deeper into the heart of the house. The air that rushed from the opening was cold and stale, as though the passage had been sealed for a lifetime. Holmes stepped forward, not pausing for a second, and I followed closely behind, my breath quickening as we entered the hidden space. The passage was small, its walls lined with the same dark wood that had been used throughout the manor. At the far end of the corridor, a faint light flickered. Holmes moved toward it with a sense of urgency, his every step echoing through the narrow hall. As we reached the light source, I saw that it came from a small alcove, barely large enough for a man to stand. Holmes knelt down, inspecting the floor, His fingers brushed over the stones, and he smiled. "Here," he said quietly. "This is what we were looking for." He pressed a stone in the corner, and the floor gave way with a low, grinding sound. Beneath it lay a small, hidden compartment's contents, obscured by dust and years of neglect. Holmes reached into the compartment and pulled out a leather-bound book, its edges frayed with age. As he flipped it open, his eyes glinted with satisfaction. "This is the truth we have been seeking," Holmes said, his voice laced with both triumph and caution. "A ledger detailing transactions of great significance, ones that Lord Wentworth has clearly gone to great lengths to hide," peered over his shoulder as he flipped through the pages. The book was filled with names, dates, and amounts, discreet notations that at first glance seemed innocuous. But as Holmes scanned the entries, I saw his expression change. "There it is," Holmes muttered, his finger tracing a particular name. "This is the key, Watson. It's a real reason Lord Wentworth would stop at nothing to conceal his son's death." The mystery had taken a sudden, unexpected turn, and we were now on the precipice of a revelation that would shatter everything we thought we knew. False trails and suspense. The ledger in Holmes' hands seemed to pulse with a strange significance, each page turning like a step closer to the abyss. I could feel my breath quicken, the mystery deepening in ways I could scarcely comprehend. The once straightforward case of a surgeon's mistake had transformed into something far more complex, more sinister. As Holmes carefully examined the entries, I could sense the shift in his focus. His eyes narrowed with the intensity of a man who had just uncovered something monumental, though I was no closer to understanding its implications. "This," Holmes murmured, tapping a finger lightly. "On the ledger is where the story truly begins, Watson." I stepped closer, attempting to peer over his shoulder, but he held the book just slightly out of my reach, his concentration absolute. His finger hovered over a particular entry, the name of a person I did not recognize, beneath the figures written. Beside the name were far more significant than I initially realized large sums of money, all transacted in what appeared to be the dead of night. The pages were filled with dates, names, and cryptic symbols that suggested a complex web of dealings. Yet, there was one name that stood out, written in bold, deliberate ink. "Ludovic Morland," Holmes muttered, as though testing the name on his tongue. "A man who does not appear in the public eye, yet his connections run deeper than anyone realizes." I felt a shiver run down my spine. Ludovic Morland. The name meant nothing to me, but the way Holmes said it, the weight in his voice, made it clear that it was important. His finger moved across the ledger to another entry, this one more recent, and I watched as Holmes' face hardened with recognition. "This is the link," Holmes said softly, his eyes scanning the details with a growing understanding. "Ludovic Morland has been in close communication with your son, Lord Wentworth. In these transactions, they are no mere business dealings." The room seemed to close in on me as I processed the weight of what Holmes was saying. The connections were becoming clearer, but still, the full extent of the conspiracy remained just beyond my grasp. I turned to Lord Wentworth, who had followed us into the narrow passage, and stood now at the entrance of the alcove, his expression unreadable. The dim light from the passageway reflected off his face, giving him an almost ghostly appearance. "Lord Wentworth," I began, though my voice seemed small in the vastness of the hidden corridor. "Do you know of this man Ludovic Morland? What is his connection to your family?" Wentworth's expression remained impassive, but I could see the tightness in his jaw, the subtle tremor in his hands. For a moment, I thought he might remain silent, but then he spoke, his voice low and measured. "I have heard the name," he said, "but only in passing. Morland is a name associated with shady dealings. He is not someone whose affairs I wish to be connected with. As for my son, he was a fool to involve himself with such a man." Holmes raised an eyebrow at Wentworth's defensive tone, but he did not press him further. Instead, he closed the ledger carefully and tucked it back into its hiding place. The real work, Holmes knew, was not in the ledger itself, but in the story behind it, one that was just beginning to unfold. Moreland is not the only thread we must follow, Holmes said, his voice steady, though I could hear the undertone of frustration. But he is an important one. There is something more to this story than mere financial dealings, Watson. I believe we are being misled by false trails. I glanced at Holmes, unsure of what he meant by that. False trails we had just uncovered. The name that seemed to unlock everything. Why would he suggest we were being misled? Holmes was never one to abandon a lead, and I knew that if he was saying this, meant something was still hidden in plain sight. It's clear that Lord Wentworth's son stumbled upon something that threatens not only the family's financial interests, but something far more personal, Holmes continued. But we must be cautious, Watson. The web is more tangled than it appears. The thought of a tangled web made my stomach churn. There were so many players in this game, so many layers to the story that I feared we would soon be overwhelmed by them. Holmes, however, had always thrived in such complexity. He reveled in it. We will return to the estate tonight, Holmes said, his tone final. We need to look beyond the obvious, Watson. The answers are often hidden in the places we least expect. We must be certain of our findings before we confront Wentworth again. As we left the hidden passage and made our way back through the maze-like corridors of the manor, I could not shake the feeling that we were walking through a house of cards, one that could topple at any moment. Each step seemed to lead us closer to an unseen precipice. Holmes, however, walked with an air of calm determination, his eyes flickering to every corner, every crevice, as though he was searching for something more. It was in his presence that I felt most acutely the depth of the mystery, as though everything was a clue, waiting to be unearthed. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Holmes kept to himself, revisiting the journal, re-examining the ledger, and rethinking every detail. I, in turn, spent my time attempting to gather more information on Ludovic Moreland, though I found little that could shed light on his true nature. There were whispers, of course, rumors of dealings in the darker corners of society, but nothing concrete, nothing to explain the depths of the connection between him and Wentworth's son. As nightfall approached, we found ourselves back at the estate. The fog had thickened, and the house loomed before us, casting long shadows in the dim light of the gas lamps. It was as though the manor itself were a silent witness to the secrets within. Holmes led the way, his steps steady and sure, though I could sense the tension in his every movement. We were no longer merely investigating a death. We were uncovering something far more dangerous. The drawing room was empty when we entered, and for a moment, I thought that Lord Wentworth had gone to bed. But no, his shadow appeared in the doorway, just as I was about to sit. He stood there, framed in the light of the hallway, his face unreadable. I thought I might find you here, Wentworth said, his voice low. I have my doubts about your methods, Mr. Holmes, but if you believe there is more to be uncovered, then you are welcome to continue your investigation. However, I warn you, there are things in this house that are better left undisturbed. Warning was clear, though I could not help but feel that it was an empty threat. Holmes, with his usual calm demeanor, met Wentworth's gaze directly. Then, Lord Wentworth, Holmes said, his voice even, we shall do just that, disturb what must be disturbed until the truth comes to light. The final pieces were beginning to fall into place, but there was still so much we did not know, and I could not shake the feeling that the most dangerous part of this case was yet to come. Chapter 4. The trap. The following days passed in a whirl of quiet tension, each moment laden with the anticipation of a revelation that never seemed to arrive. Holmes, as always, moved with a purpose, his mind darting from one piece of the puzzle to the next. I, too, remained consumed by the case, but the deeper I delved into Lord Wentworth's affairs, the more questions arose, each one leading me in directions I had not expected. The fog that clung to London seemed to extend its reach into the very heart of the Wentworth estate. The oppressive atmosphere weighed on us as we continued our investigation. But despite the growing tension, Holmes maintained his impenetrable calm. It was clear to me that he had already formed a plan, a course of action, though, as always, he kept his conclusions to himself, preferring to let the facts unfold in their own time. Late one evening, as the matter settled into its familiar stillness, Holmes came to me with an almost imperceptible smile on his face, a glimmer of satisfaction in his otherwise unreadable expression. "Watson," he said, his voice low and purposeful, "I believe we are ready to make our move." I looked at him with curiosity, my heart quickening. "What do you mean? Are you certain?" Holmes nodded, his gaze steely. "It's time to set the trap." Could not hide my confusion. The tension that had been building for days now seemed to take a new form. "A trap," I repeated. "But who is the prey?" Holmes' smile widened just a fraction. "Lord Wentworth, of course." I blinked in surprise. "Wentworth?" I asked incredulously. "But he's already been so elusive. Thought you suspected him all along." "I do suspect him, Watson," Holmes said quietly, "but that is not enough. You see, we must force his hand. We must expose him for what he truly is. And in order to do that, we need to give him a reason to act." I felt a rush of realization wash over me. Holmes' mind worked faster than my own could follow, and in that moment, I understood what he meant. It wasn't enough to gather evidence. We needed to create a situation in which Wentworth would feel cornered, one that would reveal his true intentions, his deeper involvement in the events surrounding his son's death. "Wentworth has been hiding something," Holmes continued, his voice low and deliberate. "A secret so great that he is willing to go to any lengths to protect it. But there is one thing he cannot allow to happen: someone else uncovering the truth before he can act." I nodded, now beginning to see where Holmes was going with this. "So, you intend to make him believe we have something he cannot afford to lose?" "Precisely," Holmes said, his eyes alight with a cold intensity. "We will plant the idea in his mind that we have uncovered the one thing he cannot let us expose, and then we will wait." That night, we made our preparations. The plan was simple, but Holmes knew it would be fraught with risk. We would use the ledger we had found the evidence that connected Ludovic Morland to Wentworth's son to create a sense of urgency. Holmes was convinced that the key to breaking the case lay in Morland's involvement. But we needed Wentworth to believe that the ledger contained something more dangerous, something he could not afford for anyone to see. We arranged for a discreet meeting with Wentworth, telling him that we had uncovered a crucial piece of evidence that could finally clear his son's name. In reality, it was a fabrication. There was nothing more to uncover. But the lie was necessary to set the trap in motion. "Remember, Watson," Holmes said as we prepared for the meeting, "we must play our parts to perfection. I'll present the ledger to Wentworth and let him believe that we have uncovered something far more damning than anything he could imagine. Your role is simple: stay silent, watch, and listen. He will reveal more than he intends to." I nodded, trusting in Holmes' judgment. The plan was set, and now all we had to do was wait for Wentworth's reaction. That evening, we made our way to the drawing room, where Wentworth awaited us. His usual composure had been replaced by an edge of impatience, as though he were anxious for this meeting to be over. He sat in his customary chair, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He looked more gaunt than usual, his pale face reflecting the weariness of a man who had spent too many nights awake, fretting over something he could not control. "Mr. Holmes," Wentworth greeted us, his voice tight. "What is this about? You've mentioned you have found something important." Holmes smiled faintly, though there was little warmth in it. "Indeed, my lord. I believe we have uncovered something that may prove vital to your son's case." I stood quietly to the side as Holmes approached Wentworth with the ledger in hand. The moment the book was placed before him, I could see Wentworth's eyes flickered just a brief moment of recognition before he masked his reaction. It was subtle, but Holmes did not miss it. Holmes opened the ledger, flipping through its pages slowly, as if savoring the moment. He stopped on the entry that mentioned Ludovic Morland, his finger tracing the name as he looked up at Wentworth. "This man," Holmes said casually, "has been involved in a series of transactions that are, shall we say, less than legitimate. And it seems your son was more closely involved with him than we had initially believed." Wentworth's eyes darkened at the mention of Morland's name, but he said nothing. Holmes continued, undeterred. "The money trail leads directly to Morland," Holmes said. "Atana, it appears that your son was investigating him. It also seems that some of these transactions were far more personal than you might expect." Wentworth's hands clenched into fists in his lap, his knuckles whitening. But still, he remained silent. I could sense the tension building. It seemed as though Holmes was deliberately pushing him to the brink. "I believe," Holmes said, his voice calm but firm, "that this ledger contains information that could ruin you, my lord. It's not just about your son's death. It's about what was uncovered in the process. You must have known that, didn't you?" The room was silent as Wentworth's gaze shifted from the ledger to Holmes, his expression now a mask of controlled fury. "What are you trying to suggest, Holmes?" Wentworth's voice was low, dangerous. Holmes smiled, almost imperceptibly. "I'm suggesting, Lord Wentworth, that you have much more to lose than you think. This ledger is only the beginning." The silence that followed was deafening. Wentworth's eyes narrowed, and for the first time I saw the hint of a crack in his facade. Kay was not prepared for this. And then, as Holmes had predicted, Wentworth's defenses faltered. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he moved toward the door. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Holmes," he spat. "Kay, there are things you cannot understand. Kay, you are playing a dangerous game, and you will regret it." Holmes remained calm, his smile never wavering. "We shall see, my lord." As Wentworth disappeared into the hallway, I turned to Holmes, my mind racing. "Do you think he knows we're close, Holmes?" Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had just set a trap. "He knows, Watson. He knows that we're getting closer to the truth. And that's exactly what we wanted. We were no longer playing a game of deduction. Now, we were in a race against time with Lord Wentworth as the prey, and Holmes had already set the stage for his capture. The confession, or catch the air in the Wentworth estate, seemed heavier the next day, as though the house itself was bracing for something to happen. Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet, his usual calm demeanor giving way to an intensity that I had not yet witnessed in this investigation. He moved through the manor with a deliberate purpose, his mind clearly working through every angle of the case, but not yet ready to reveal all of his conclusions. I followed him, knowing better than to press him for answers. The game was nearing its end, but the final steps were the most crucial. And Holmes never took chances. As the day wore on, we continued our quiet surveillance of Lord Wentworth's movements, watching for any signs that he might make a rash move. Holmes, as always, seemed attuned to the smallest changes in the house's rhythm. Wentworth's demeanor had shifted since our confrontation the night before. His usual calm had been replaced by a thinly veiled anxiety that was starting to crack beneath the surface. His interactions with the servants were terse, his responses to his staff's questions curt and impatient. It was clear he was losing control of the situation. By late afternoon, we received word that Wentworth had requested another meeting. The message was brought to us by the butler, who seemed to regard the summons with a mixture of caution and curiosity. I exchanged a glance with Holmes, who nodded once, the gleam in his eyes telling me that the trap was about to snap shut. "Very well," Holmes said, his voice low and decisive. "We'll meet with him again. This time, however, we'll be prepared for whatever he intends." As we made our way to the drawing room, I could feel the weight of the investigation pressing down on me. Everything had been leading to this moment. We had baited Wentworth into a corner, and now we were going to see if he would take the bait or lash out in desperation. Wentworth was already seated in his usual chair when we entered the room. His posture was stiff, and his fingers were twitching, nervously, as though he were trying to control some deep-seated anxiety. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but the warmth of the room seemed to be lost on him. His eyes darted back and forth between Holmes and myself, calculating, waiting for one of us to speak. "Mr. Holmes," Wentworth began, his voice strained, "I believe you've made your point quite clear. You've found something you believe will be of great consequence. But I assure you, I will not be intimidated by baseless accusations." Holmes, ever calm and collected, did not rush to answer. Instead, he took a few slow steps toward the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied Wentworth with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the man's defenses. "I have not made any accusations, Lord Wentworth," Holmes said quietly. "I have merely presented the facts. You, however, have chosen to hide the truth." Wentworth stiffened at the words, his eyes narrowing with barely contained frustration. "The truth," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You speak as though you have uncovered some great conspiracy, but you have nothing. Your so-called evidence is nothing more than speculation. Holmes did not flinch at Wentworth's outburst. Instead, he tilted his head, regarding the man with a mixture of curiosity and resolve. "No, my lord, the evidence is more than speculation. It is concrete, and you know it." I watched as the tension between the two men thickened, the words hanging heavy in the room. Wentworth's composure, once his greatest asset, was slipping, his hands clenched into fists in his lap, and I could see the anger bubbling beneath the surface. The facade he had so carefully constructed was beginning to crumble. "I don't know what you think you've uncovered, Holmes," Wentworth said through gritted teeth, his voice low and venomous. "But I warn, will not let you destroy everything I've worked for. My son's death. It was a tragedy, but it is no longer your concern. You are meddling in things that you cannot possibly understand." Holmes stepped forward then, his movements deliberate and measured. "Your son's death, Lord Wentworth, was no mere tragedy," he said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable weight. "It was part of a much larger scheme, one that involves far more than just your family's reputation. It involves people who will stop at nothing to keep the truth hidden." Wentworth's breath caught in his throat, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. It was quick, a mere moment, but it was enough. Holmes had him on the edge, and it seemed only a matter of time before Wentworth's carefully crafted defenses would collapse entirely. "What do you want from me?" Wentworth asked, his voice barely a whisper now. "What more can you possibly need?" Holmes stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the man before him. "Want the truth, Lord Wentworth, the whole truth. You know what you have done, and you know the lengths you've gone to in order to cover it up. The ledger, the transactions with Ludovic Morlandese are not the actions of a man who is simply trying to protect his family. Okay, no, these are the actions of a man who is hiding something much more dangerous." Wentworth's eyes flickered, once again, this time with something darker than fear-anger, perhaps, or a sense of powerlessness. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he hissed. "You think you can unravel everything, but you can't. Some things are too dangerous to expose. Some things are too powerful." Holmes did not flinch. "Then you admit it," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You admit that you have been hiding something all along. You also admit that whatever it is worth killing for." Words hung in the air like a weight that neither of us could escape. I watched Wentworth closely, knowing that Holmes had pushed him to the breaking point. And then, finally, Wentworth's mask cracked with a sudden, sharp movement. He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "I did what I had to do," he shouted, his voice raw with emotion. "I had no choice. My son was too close to the truth. He was going to ruin everything. Couldn't let him expose it all. You don't understand the forces at play here, Holmes. Moreland would have destroyed us all. He would have exposed us, and everything I built would have come crashing down." Holmes watched him carefully, his expression unchanged. "And so you killed your son?" he said, as if simply stating a fact. Wentworth's eyes blazed with rage. "Yes," he spat. "Yes, I killed him, but it was for the greater good, ain't you? Don't understand Moreland's plans, the dealings with the syndicate, the power that we had. It all had to be protected. My son was weak, and I couldn't let him ruin everything." I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The confession came as a shock, but it was not one I could refute. Lord Wentworth had admitted to what I had long suspected, and yet the enormity of his actions still left me in disbelief. Holmes took a step back, his eyes cold and calculating. "Your son may have been weak, Lord Wentworth, but you are the one who is truly broken. The truth will come to light, no matter what you do." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the crackling fire. Wentworth, now fully undone, sank back into his chair, his face pale and drawn. He had confessed, but at what cost? His carefully constructed world was crumbling, and there was no turning back. Holmes turned to me, his expression as inscrutable as ever. "It's over now, Watson," he said softly. "The truth has been revealed." But even as he spoke those words, I knew that the case was far from finished. Wentworth's confession had merely opened the door to a much darker truth. The game, it seemed, had only just begun. Chapter 5, the aftermath of confession, hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating all attempts at clarity. Wentworth, having admitted to his son's murder, sat slumped in his chair, his face pale and twisted in a mixture of exhaustion and remorse. He had confessed, but at what cost? The room had gone deathly silent, the fire's crackling sound now. The only noise that filled the space, his confession, raw and bitter, had shattered the facade of calm that had surrounded the Wentworth estate. But the truth seemed to hold no satisfaction, only a deep, aching emptiness. Holmes, ever the stoic observer, had not flinched during Wentworth's outburst. He stood motionless, his eyes locked on the broken man before him. I had seen Holmes confront criminals before, but there was something different about this moment, something that went beyond the typical satisfaction of a case solved. The finality of Wentworth's confession seemed to leave no room for further investigation, no more questions to ask. And yet, I knew that Holmes was not one to rest on the laurels of a confession alone. There was more to this than the murder of one man. "Lord Wentworth," Holmes said, breaking the silence, his voice soft but steady. "You have confessed to the crime, and you will face the consequences of your actions. But there is still one question left unanswered." Wentworth, eyes still locked to the floor, did not respond at first. Could see his shoulders sagging with the weight of his guilt. He was no longer the powerful, controlling figure who had kept his composure throughout the investigation. Now, he was just a man who had been brought to his knees by his own choices. What more is there to say? Wentworth whispered, his voice strained and broken. Holmes stepped closer, his gaze unyielding. "You've confessed to your son's murder, yes, but what about the men behind this entire scheme? What about the true nature of your dealings with Ludovic Morland? Wentworth's head shot up at the mention of Morland's name. For a moment, the look in his eyes was one of defiance. Then it quickly shifted back to guilt, as though he had been caught in yet another lie. "I told you," Wentworth muttered, his hands trembling as he clenched them into fists. Morland was going to destroy everything. My son knew too much. He was weak, but he knew too much. Holmes' eyes flickered with cold understanding. "Did not kill your son just to protect your family's reputation, Lord Wentworth. You killed him to protect something much larger, something even more dangerous." I could feel the weight of Holmes' words, but there was a part of me still struggling to piece it all together. What was Wentworth trying to protect beyond his family's wealth and status? What could be so dangerous that it would drive a man to murder his own flesh and blood? Wentworth's shoulders trembled with a barely restrained fury. "You don't understand," he spat. "There are forces at work here that you cannot even begin to comprehend. This is bigger than all of you." His words hung in the air, and I could see the flicker of something dark in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had realized too late that the power he sought had become a shackle, pulling him down into a pit he could not escape. Holmes stepped back slightly, his gaze softening, though it remained focused. "I understand more than you think, Lord Wentworth," Holmes said calmly. "I understand that you thought you could control the power that had you in its grip, but the truth is, you have already lost." Wentworth's hands shook violently now, and he looked at Holmes with a mix of fear and disbelief. "Do you mean lost?" he asked, his voice cracking with the weight of his own emotions. "I have done what I had to do to survive. My son was weak, and I had to protect us." Holmes' expression was unreadable, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, something almost imperceptible, as if he were moving toward the final conclusion. "Do you think you were protecting your family, Lord Wentworth? But in truth, you were protecting something else, something much darker. Your son's death was only the beginning." I stepped forward, eager to understand, but hesitant to speak out of turn. "Holmes," I began, "what are you suggesting? What more is there to this? Is Wentworth truly the mastermind behind all of this?" Holmes turned to me, his gaze penetrating. "No, Watson. Lord Wentworth is a pawn in a much larger game. His confession was only the beginning of what we need to uncover. The question now is not who murdered Wentworth's son, but why was it necessary to silence him?" Wentworth's face twisted in anguish as he tried to maintain his composure. "I didn't have a choice," he murmured. "Morland, he was the key. The syndicate was using us. They were using my son. I had no way out." "Then tell us," Holmes pressed. "Tell us everything. You've already confessed to the murder, but you have yet to reveal the full extent of your involvement in the syndicate's operations." Wentworth's face contorted with a mix of despair and fear, his voice faltering. I can't. You don't understand what they would do to me, to all of us. The money, the power, it's all too much. I had no choice but to follow Morland's lead. He had us trapped." Holmes did not relent. "And you thought you could outsmart them? You could outsmart them? That's where you were wrong. Morland may have been the one pulling the strings, but you are complicit in these dealings. You've made deals with men whose reach extends far beyond this estate, and now you must face the consequences." I could see the weight of Holmes' words taking hold. Wentworth's mind was racing, his eyes darting back and forth, as if searching for a way out. But there was no escape now. The trap had been set, and Wentworth had walked into it willingly. Finally, he collapsed back into the chair, his body racked with sobs. "I'm sorry," he whispered, as though the words were the only thing left to him. "I didn't want it to go this far. I didn't want to hurt anyone. but it was too late. I had to protect us. Holmes stepped forward and placed a hand gently on the man's shoulder. You didn't protect anyone, Lord Wentworth, Holmes said quietly. You only dug your own grave. The silence in the room was profound, and for the first time, I saw Wentworth not as a criminal, but as a broken man who had been consumed by his own ambition, by forces far beyond his control. It was a tragic end, one that left no room for redemption, only the cold reality of consequence. As I stood there, watching Holmes as he absorbed the weight of the case's conclusion, I knew that this would not be the end of the story. There were still questions to be answered, still pieces of the puzzle that remained hidden. But for now, the trap had been set, and Lord Wentworth had revealed his true nature. The rest of the story would unfold in time, but for now, we had our answer. Chapter 6, the final threat. The atmosphere in the Wentworth estate had shifted, as if the very air had grown heavier since Lord Wentworth's confession. The silence that followed, his breakdown felt oppressive, each moment stretching longer than the last. I watched as Holmes, ever the enigmatic figure, remained calm amidst the chaos that surrounded us. Wentworth had spoken, and yet there was a sense that we were only now beginning to uncover the full extent of the mystery. Wentworth's hands trembled as he sat before us, his head hanging low. The once imposing man had crumbled under the weight of his guilt, his confession shattering the veneer of control he had clung to for so long. He had admitted to the murder of his son, but the reasons behind it, those still remained murky. And the truth was only just beginning to emerge. Holmes, who had stood silently for the past few moments, finally spoke, his voice soft but commanding. Lord Wentworth, he began, you have confessed to the murder of your son. But you have yet to reveal the full scope of your actions. There are still unanswered questions, and we need you to tell us everything. Wentworth looked up slowly, his eyes hollow and filled with regret. I told you everything, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I killed him to protect us all. Moreland, the syndicate my son had uncovered too much. He was going to expose everything. You don't understand the power they wield. Holmes, however, was not so easily satisfied. I understand, Lord Wentworth, he said, his voice steady. But what I do not understand is why you are still protecting Ludovic Moreland. You mentioned his name several times in your confession, but you have yet to tell us the full extent of his involvement in this. Wentworth's face contorted in fear as he shook his head. Moreland, he's a powerful man, Holmes. You have no idea how far-reaching his influence is. If I tell you everything, they'll come for me, they'll come for all of us. You don't know what you're dealing with. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes sharp and focused. You are not in control of this situation anymore, Lord Wentworth, he said, his voice unwavering. You have already exposed yourself, and the only way for you to regain any semblance of control is to reveal everything. We need to understand who Moreland is and what he was truly after. Only then can we bring this to a close. Wentworth's gaze flickered nervously toward the door, his thoughts racing. I could see that he was torn, caught between the desire to protect whatever remained of his life and the overwhelming need to unburden himself of the truth. It was a moment of reckoning for the man-one that would determine his fate. Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath, Wentworth spoke, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. Moreland, he began, his words slow and measured. T was not just a business associate. He was part of something much bigger, criminal syndicate that operates in the shadows. I had no choice but to work with him. I thought I could control it, but I was wrong. They used me, and they used my son. My son discovered their dealings, the true nature of their operations, and he was going to expose them. I couldn't let that happen. Holmes listened intently, his eyes never leaving Wentworth as the man continued his reluctant confession. Syndicate deals in more than just money. It's about control, about power over people, over governments, over entire industries. My son was getting too close to unraveling it all, and I realized he was going to expose everything. I knew what had to be done. Wentworth paused for a moment, his eyes haunted as he relived the events in his mind. I didn't want to kill him, Kay, but I had no choice. I had to protect my family, my legacy. I thought I could stop them from destroying everything, but in the end, I've only made it worse. Holmes remained silent, his gaze calculating as he processed Wentworth's words. The truth was beginning to take shape, but there were still more pieces to the puzzle. The syndicate, Morland, the power they wielded, these were all crucial elements. But the question remained, what had Wentworth truly done to protect himself, and why had he resorted to murder? And now, Holmes asked, his voice calm but insistent. What happens now, Lord Wentworth? You've confessed to the murder, but the syndicate Morland, they are still out there. They will not let you go so easily. Wentworth's face twisted in despair. I don't know, he whispered. I've already lost everything. I'm a dead man walking. I thought I could escape, but they'll find me. They'll come after me, after my family, after everyone I've ever known. Holmes stepped back, his gaze unwavering. You're right about one thing, Lord Wentworth, he said. You've already lost everything, but that does not mean you can't still do something to make it right. You've taken the first step by confessing, but there is more to be done. We need your help to bring this syndicate down. Wentworth looked up at Holmes, his expression conflicted. And how do you expect me to do that? He asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. I have no power left. I'm a broken man. I don't know how to stop them. Holmes turned to me, his eyes glinting with a sense of purpose. We don't need him to stop them, Watson. We need him to help us understand who they are, where they operate, and who else is involved. Once we have that information, we can move against them. Together, we can bring them to justice. I nodded, though the weight of the situation was not lost on me. The complexity of the case had grown beyond what I had imagined when we first stepped foot in the Wentworth estate. What began as a simple murder investigation had now become a tangled web of criminal conspiracy, hidden power, and betrayal. We were no longer simply trying to solve a murder. We were trying to dismantle a criminal empire. Wentworth, still broken and desperate, looked at us with a mixture of resignation and hope. I'll help you, he said, his voice shaking, but I don't know if it will be enough. The syndicate is powerful. I don't know if anyone can stop them. Holmes placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression as cold and calculating as ever. We'll see, Lord Wentworth, we'll see. With that, the room fell silent again. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fall into place, but there was still much work to be done. The road ahead was long, and the challenges were far from over. But with Wentworth's confession, we had a starting point. The final thread of the mystery had been pulled, and now we could begin to unravel the rest. As Holmes and I left the drawing room, I couldn't shake the feeling that the true danger was still ahead of us. The syndicate, Morland, they were out there, somewhere, waiting. And we were about to walk straight into their den of shadows. The silent pursuit the following days were marked by an uneasy silence. Each passing moment weighed down by the gravity of what had been uncovered. Lord Wentworth's confession had cracked open the door to a world we had only begun to understand. And though we had made significant strides, the most dangerous part of our investigation still lay ahead. With every step, Holmes grew more determined, and I, too, found myself consumed by the growing realization that this case would be far more complicated than I had ever anticipated. Wentworth had provided us with enough information to make our next move, but that was where the true challenge began. The syndicate, led by Ludovic Morland, remained an enigma. Its power and reach stretching far beyond anything we had initially imagined. Wentworth's knowledge, though invaluable, had been limited. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became that we were dealing with a network that had been carefully constructed over years, hidden in plain sight, manipulating the powerful and the weak alike. As Holmes sat at the desk in our temporary office, his gaze focused on the piles of notes and documents that we had gathered, I couldn't help but notice the strain that had settled on him. His mind, as always, was working at a pace far beyond mine. The toll that the case was beginning to show in the tightness of his jaw and the subtle tension in his movements. Watson, Holmes said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. There is more to Moreland than we've seen so far. We need to delve deeper into his connections, specifically those in the upper echelons of society. This syndicate has its roots in more than just crime. It has influence in politics, in business, and even within the law itself. I nodded, my mind racing to keep up with his thought process. You believe Moreland has connections within the establishment? Holmes nodded, his eyes narrowing as he continued to sift through the papers beforehand. Absolutely, the syndicate is not just a criminal organization. It is a machine, one that feeds on power, wealth, and control. If we are to bring it down, we need to understand where Moreland's reach ends and where the rest of the world begins. The implications of Holmes' words sent a chill through me. I had been so focused on the murder and the immediate aftermath that I had failed to consider the broader picture. This was not simply about one man's crimes. It was about an entire system, a network that had corrupted everything it touched. Where do we begin? I asked, already knowing that Holmes had no intention of waiting for an answer. He was already moving toward the door, grabbing his coat and his hat with a swift, practiced motion. We start with the connections. Wentworth has mentioned his dealings with Moreland. If we can uncover who else was involved, we may be able to trace the syndicate's true origins. Left the office and made our way back to the Wentworth estate, the fog of London thickening as we crossed the city streets. The sense of foreboding I had felt since the beginning of this investigation seemed to intensify with every step we took toward the estate. Lord Wentworth, broken and vulnerable, had promised to help us further, but I knew that his knowledge, limited as it was, could only take us so far. We needed more crucial lead, something that would push us past the edge of the unknown and into the heart of the conspiracy. When we arrived at the estate, Wentworth was waiting for us, his face still pale and drawn from the weight of his confession. He was seated in the drawing room, the same place where we had confronted him days before. His expression was guarded now, as though he knew that the answers he provided would determine the course of his future. Holmes did not waste time with pleasantries. He sat down across from Wentworth, his posture sharp and commanding. Lord Wentworth, I trust you've had time to reflect on our conversation. We need more information specifically about the individuals who were involved in the syndicate's dealings. I suspect that Moreland is not acting alone. There are others who have a stake in this, and we need to identify them. Wentworth shifted uneasily in his seat, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. I told you before, he said, his voice strained. Moreland is the one pulling the strings. The others, they are just puppets, pawns in his game. I don't know who they are, only that they are powerful men who can make things happen. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Wentworth's face. You know more than you're letting on, my lord. You're not just a victim in this story, you're complicit. You've been a part of this web for far too long to pretend that you don't know more. Wentworth's eyes darted to the side, his face twisting with a mix of fear and guilt. I never wanted this to happen, okay? I never wanted to get involved with Moreland, but I had no choice. He had his hooks in me, in my family. I didn't know where else to turn. Holmes studied him for a moment, his gaze sharp and unwavering. You've already admitted to your role in this, Lord Wentworth, but now you must help us. We cannot stop the syndicate. if you refuse to tell us everything you know." Wentworth exhaled deeply, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "There's one name I remember," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A man named Douglas Trent. He's one of Moreland's closest associates. I don't know much about him, but I've seen him with Moreland on several occasions. He's dangerous." Holmes' eyes lit up at the mention of Trent's name, his mind already processing the new information. "Douglas Trent," Holmes repeated, his voice steady. "Do you know where we can find him?" Wentworth hesitated, clearly unsure of the answer. "I don't know. He's a shadow. He comes and goes, but he's always involved in the most important matters. He's connected to some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the city. Moreland trusts him, then he's no ordinary criminal." Holmes nodded, his mind already shifting to the next step. "We will find Trent, and when we do, we will have the key to unraveling this entire syndicate. The rest of Moreland's network will follow." Wentworth looked at him with a mixture of fear and hope. "And when you find him, what then? Will happen to me?" Holmes' gaze softened just slightly. "You have already chosen your path, Lord Wentworth. Now you must face the consequences. But there is still a chance for you to make amends. Help us bring down the syndicate, and you may yet redeem yourself." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of what had been revealed. Wentworth's future was uncertain, and though the truth had been laid bare, there was still much to uncover. Trent was the key, and Holmes' mind was already turning, calculating their next move. "We will find Trent." "Watson," Holmes said, his voice filled with quiet resolve, "and when we do, the syndicate will begin to unravel." Nodded, knowing that the game was not yet over. The truth was still out there, hidden beneath layers of deceit and corruption, and we were getting closer to exposing it all. Chapter 7. The silent partner of the days that followed Lord. Wentworth's revelation were marked by an unsettling sense of urgency. Holmes, as ever, wasted no time. The name Douglas Trent echoed, in my mind, growing more significant with every passing hour. Wentworth's words had opened a door crack in the web that had enshrouded the entire syndicate. Trent was the key. He had to be, but where was he? And what part did he play in Moreland's vast, hidden empire? Holmes was methodical as always, his mind already moving toward the next logical step. I knew that with Trent's name, we had something tangible. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but there was still much work to be done. Wentworth had provided us with a name, but that was just the first step. Trent was no mere associate of Moreland. He was a shadowy figure, one who could slip through the cracks of society unnoticed, with connections to the wealthiest and most influential people in the city. For days, Holmes worked tirelessly, poring over every piece of information we had gathered. The syndicate, the murder, the web of corruption. It was all tied together in ways that were still not entirely clear. But one thing was certain: Trent was at the center of it all. And until we found him, the full extent of the conspiracy would remain beyond our grasp. It was on the fourth day after our meeting with Wentworth that Holmes called me into our small, dimly lit office. He was standing by the window, his eyes narrowed as he looked out over the fog-draped city. The look on his face told me that he had made a breakthrough. I approached him, my curiosity piqued. "What's it?" Holmes said, his voice calm but filled with the intensity I had come to recognize in him when he was close to something. "We have a lead on Trent. It seems that he is not entirely as elusive as we thought." I felt a surge of anticipation. "How do you mean?" Holmes turned toward me, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I have a source from one with information on Trent's whereabouts. It seems that he frequents a particular club in the heart of London, one that caters to the city's elite. The name of the place is the Black Crescent, it's a well-guarded secret, known only to those who move in the highest circles. Trent is as connected as we suspect. Then this is the place to start. The words sent a jolt through me. A club for the elite. Hidden from the public, just the sort of place where someone like Trent would make his contacts and pull the strings of his criminal empire. I knew then that the investigation was entering its most dangerous phase. Betrayal. We go? I asked, already preparing myself for the next step. Holmes' eyes gleamed with purpose. Tonight, I'll need you with me, Watson. We'll go in, observe, and see what we can learn. Trent may not be there, but we will get closer to him, one way or another. The night air was cold as we made our way to the heart of the city. The streets were darker than usual, shrouded in thick mist, and the gas lamps cast long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe in the fog. Holmes moved with his usual quiet confidence, his every step deliberate and sure. I followed closely behind, feeling the weight of the night press down on me as we neared the club. I could see it before us, an unassuming door set into the side of a building, flanked by two tall, grim-faced doormen. The faint glow of lantern lights spilled out from beneath the door, casting shadows on the pavement. It was impossible to tell what lay beyond, but I had no doubt that the world inside was far removed from the one we had just left. Holmes approached the door without hesitation, his hand lifting to knock twice sharply in a way that signaled both confidence and purpose. The doorman, a massive figure in a dark suit, glanced at us, his expression unreadable. Name? The doorman asked gruffly. Holmes did not flinch. Sherlock Holmes, we have business here. The doorman studied him for a long moment, then nodded, stepping aside to allow us entry. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway leading into a plush interior. The air inside was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and velvet. Dim lighting illuminated the walls, casting everything in a soft, golden glow. We were ushered inside, where a series of rooms opened before us, each one filled with people I recognized only by their opulence and sense of entitlement. The club was everything I had imagined it to be, a place where the powerful could gather in secrecy, away from prying eyes. It was an atmosphere of control, of the untouchable elite, their every movement calculated and deliberate. Holmes and I moved through the crowd with purpose, our eyes scanning the room for any sign of Trent. But the man we sought was nowhere to be found. We made our way to a corner where Holmes took a seat at a small, round table, his gaze never faltering. I stood nearby, my eyes sweeping over the patrons, well-dressed men and women engaged in low, whispered conversations, their faces hidden behind veils of politeness and deception. The air was thick with intrigue, the kind of place where deals were made and secrets were exchanged. Holmes leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. We must be patient, Watson. Trent may be watching us already, and it's better to make our move when he doesn't know we're looking for him. The key is to blend in and wait for the right moment. I nodded, understanding the strategy. Holmes had always believed that the best way to catch someone was not to pursue them directly, but to make them come to you, unaware of the trap you had set. Minutes turned into hours as we sat in the shadows, serving the comings and goings of the club's patrons. It was as if the place had become a living entity, its pulse quickening with every whispered conversation and every furtive glance. The deeper we ventured into this world, the more I felt the grip of danger tightening around us, just as I was beginning to feel the weight of the weight. A familiar figure appeared at the far end of the room. It was a man I had seen only briefly in the shadows. Douglas. Trent. He moved through the crowd with a grace that belied his size, his eyes scanning the room with calculated precision. He was a man who belonged in this world, and I knew then that we were finally close to the truth. Holmes' eyes locked onto Trent, and I could see the flicker of satisfaction in his gaze. The trap had been set, and the prey had walked right into it. "We have him now," Holmes murmured, rising from his seat. "Let's see how far he's willing to go to protect his secrets." As we moved toward Trent, I could feel the tension in the air. We were no longer spectators in this dangerous game. We were players. And the stakes had just risen higher than I had anticipated. The silent witness Douglas, Trent, was no longer a shadow among the crowd. As he moved through the room, his presence seemed to cut through the layers of deception and opulence like a blade, his every movement precise and deliberate. It was clear now he was a man accustomed to the weight of his own power, one who knew how to command a room without speaking a word. His very mannerisms exuded authority, and I could feel the gravity of the situation settling over me like a dark cloud. Holmes, however, was not moved by Trent's imposing presence. His expression remained as unreadable as ever, his eyes cold and calculating as they tracked Trent's every move. I, on the other hand, felt a nervous tension building in my chest. This was the moment we had been waiting for, the moment when we would finally confront the man at the center of this web of crime, power, and deceit. But as Holmes and I moved toward Trent, I realized that this would not be a confrontation in the traditional sense. No, Holmes had a different plan, one that involved patience, subtlety, and the quiet art of manipulation. We followed Trent to a corner of the room, where he conversed briefly with a group of well-dressed men. His voice was low and controlled, his words carrying weight, but I could not make out the details of the conversation. It was as if Trent were performing some subtle dance, engaging in an exchange of information with the ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times before. Holmes leaned closer to me, his voice barely a whisper. "This is our chance, Watson. We can't approach him directly just yet. He's too aware of his surroundings. We'll need to wait until he shows us a weakness." I nodded, trusting Holmes' judgment, though I couldn't help but feel the pull of urgency. It's the weight of the investigation, the complexity of the case, and the dangerous unknowns that still lurked in the shadows all seemed to press in on me. It felt as though every moment was leading us closer to a revelation, one that would expose the truth and, in the process, change everything. We remained at a distance, watching as Trent continued his conversation. His demeanor had not shifted, but I could see the flickers of something beneath the surface, something in the way his eyes moved, something in his subtle gestures that hinted at a deeper knowledge of the game he was playing. It was as if he knew we were watching him, aware of the threat we posed, yet he did not seem to care. The confidence he exuded was unsettling, and I began to understand why he had been able to maintain such a position of power within the syndicate. Holmes' gaze never wavered from Trent. He was reading the man, understanding the small, imperceptible movements that told the true story of his character. I could see the tension in Holmes' posture, his mind working at full speed as he calculated their next move. There was a quiet intensity to him now, one that I had come to recognize as a sign that he was close to unraveling something significant. "He's not acting alone," Holmes said softly, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Trent's connections run deeper than we've seen. This isn't just about Moreland or Wentworth. There's something bigger at play here." I glanced back at Trent, my mind racing to catch up with Holmes' deductions. "What do you mean?" I asked, though the answer already seemed to be forming. In my mind, Holmes' eyes flickered to me, his expression unreadable. "I suspect that Trent is a front for someone more powerful, someone we have yet to identify. He is a shield, a distraction. Moreland is not the only player in this game." I felt a shiver of realization run down my spine. We had always assumed that Moreland was the mastermind behind the syndicate. But now, it seemed that there was someone even more dangerous, someone whose identity remained hidden in the shadows. "We need to know who he's working for," Holmes murmured. "But we cannot rush this. If we push too hard, we'll lose him." For the next hour, we watched from the sidelines as Trent moved about the club, speaking to various individuals, his interactions smooth and calculated. He seemed to be a part of the very fabric of this world, blending in seamlessly with the other powerful figures who surrounded him. Holmes remained in the corner of the room, observing, waiting for the right moment to make his move. His patience was evident, but I could feel the growing tension in my chest. Every moment we spent here seemed to bring us closer to a dangerous precipice. At last, the moment came. Trent made his way toward a private door, his back to the crowd, his gaze momentarily distracted. It was as though the room parted just for him, allowing him to slip through unnoticed. I saw the opportunity before Holmes did, but he was already moving, a silent, fluid figure that blended into the crowd with ease. I followed closely behind, matching his every step as we made our way toward the door. The doorman, who had not seen us approach, opened the door without a second thought. We stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind us, and found ourselves in a narrow corridor that led deeper into the building. The club, it seemed, had more to it than met the eye-hidden rooms, back halls, and corridors designed to keep unwanted attention away from its true activities. We moved swiftly but quietly, following Trent's footsteps as he made his way through the labyrinthine passageways. Holmes' instincts were razor-sharp, and it was clear he was leading us to something important. We reached the end of the corridor and found ourselves in front of a small, ornate door. Trent had paused just beyond it, speaking in hushed tones with another figure, someone I could not yet identify. Holmes motioned for me to stay back as he crept closer, his steps silent on the polished floor. I watched in awe as he leaned in, positioning himself just close enough to hear their conversation without being detected. The figure spoke in a low, clipped voice, his words indistinct, but the tone was one of urgency. Trent responded, his voice calm, but there was an undercurrent of tension that I could not ignore. "It's time," Trent said quietly, his words carrying just enough for Holmes to catch them. "The final piece is in place. We move tomorrow." Holmes' eyes locked onto Trent's face, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The significance of the conversation hung in the air like a heavy weight. Tomorrow, that was when everything would change. But what would happen then? And who was this mysterious figure with Trent? Holmes motioned for me to remain still as he carefully withdrew from the door. Our plan was clear now. Trent was about to make his move, and if we could follow him, we might finally uncover the identity of the person truly pulling the strings behind this web of corruption. But we would need to act quickly. The clock was ticking, and every second brought us closer to the final confrontation. Chapter 8, The Unseen Hand. The words, "We move tomorrow," echoed in my mind long after Trent and the mysterious figure had disappeared behind the door. Holmes had seen it too, the tension in Trent's voice, the certainty of their plans. Tomorrow was the day. Everything had been building to this moment, and yet, despite the clarity of our objective, the deeper question remained. What exactly was the final piece? And who else was involved in the network that had spiraled out of our control? Holmes and I retreated into the shadows of the narrow corridor. I could feel the weight of the investigation pressing down upon me. We had made considerable progress, but the true nature of the syndicate was still elusive. Moreland, Trent, Wentworth, these were just the outward faces of something far darker, far more dangerous than we had originally imagined. Holmes, ever the strategist, did not waste time with idle speculation. "Tomorrow, Watson," he murmured, his voice low, "we need to be ready. The pieces are falling into place." but we still don't know who they're working for or how deep this goes. I nodded, my mind racing. You think we'll find out? Tomorrow. Holmes' eyes narrowed, his expression focused and sharp. If we're lucky, Watson. If we're not, then we'll be walking into a trap. The rest of the night was spent in preparation. Holmes was meticulous, as always, pulling together every thread of evidence we had gathered. The ledger, Wentworth's confession, the name of Douglas Trent, right? And now, this cryptic conversation. We had learned that the syndicate was far more organized than a group of common criminals. It was a machine, a real-world operation that stretched into the highest echelons of society. Morland was just one player, and Trent was another. But the final piece, the one they were planning for tomorrow, remained out of reach. At dawn, we made our way back to the estate. The city was still shrouded in the early morning mist, the streets quiet, save for the occasional carriage rolling past. The air was thick with anticipation, and I could feel the tension rising as Holmes and I walked side by side, neither of us willing to speak. We knew that today was the day everything would come to a head. When we arrived at the Wentworth estate, Lord Wentworth was waiting for us in the drawing room, his face drawn and pale. He had aged visibly in the past few days, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep and the burden of his guilt. It was clear that his confession had broken him, but the man who sat before us was not the same one we had met initially, the imperious figure who had tried to control every aspect of the situation. He was a broken shell of a man, desperate for any semblance of redemption. Holmes, Wentworth said quietly, his voice hoarse. I'm afraid it's too late. You can't stop them now. They've already set things in motion. Holmes did not respond immediately, his eyes scanning Wentworth's face, reading every subtle shift in his expression. It was clear that Wentworth knew more than he had let on. He had been involved in something far deeper than we had originally imagined, and now he was the one who was afraid. What do you mean, my lord? Holmes asked, his voice calm but firm. You said they were moving tomorrow. What exactly is going to happen? Wentworth shook his head, his hands trembling. I can't tell you. I don't know all the details, but I know it's dangerous. The final piece. They've been waiting for this moment for a long time. They've been planning it for years. I stepped forward, my voice rising with frustration. Tell us what you know, Wentworth. We've given you a chance to redeem yourself. You owe it to your son, to the people you've hurt, to tell us everything. Wentworth met my gaze, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and regret. I've told you all I can, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Morland, Trent, they're not the ones in control. There's someone else, someone above them, someone who has the power to destroy everything. Holmes' eyes narrowed at this revelation. Who is this person? Wentworth looked around the room nervously, as though the very walls had ears. He lowered his voice, almost to a whisper. I don't know the name, but I know the power. It's not just money or influence they're after. It's control, absolute control over the entire city. It's over everything. I glanced at Holmes, whose expression remained unchanged, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. He had suspected all along that there was someone pulling the strings, someone we had not yet uncovered. But this revelation, this shadowy figure hidden in the shadows, was a game changer. Holmes' voice was low, almost to the point of being inaudible. And what did they want, Wentworth? What is it that they've been planning for so long? Wentworth shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. I don't know, Holmes. I don't know. But whatever it is, it's going to change everything. You have to stop them. You have to find them before it's too late. Holmes remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on Wentworth as he processed this new information. The truth was slowly taking shape. but it was still incomplete. We had the pieces, but there were large gaps that still needed to be filled in order to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. Finally, Holmes stood up, his movements precise and measured. "We need to move quickly, Watson. Clock is ticking, and we're running out of time. Wentworth has given us a lead, but we need to find out who this figure is, and fast." Wentworth looked up at him, his face filled with a mixture of hope and despair. "Can you stop them?" Holmes' expression softened just slightly, though there was still a coldness in his eyes. "I don't know, Wentworth, but we have no choice but to try." The urgency in Holmes' voice was undeniable. We had been dancing around the truth for too long, but now it was clear that we were closing in on something far more dangerous than we had anticipated. The final piece of the puzzle was still out of reach, okay? But we were getting closer. I followed Holmes out of the room, my mind racing with the possibilities. The syndicate, the hidden figures, the shadowy forces that had been manipulating everything from behind the scenes. It was all coming to a head. But what would happen when we finally uncovered the true mastermind? Would we be able to stop them before they executed whatever plan they had in mind? The weight of the investigation seemed to hang over me more heavily than ever before. We had made significant progress, but there was still so much we didn't know. The clock was ticking, and the final confrontation was drawing near. The reckoning, the next few hours passed in a blur, the weight of the investigation pressing down on me with an almost unbearable intensity. Holmes had always been able to see the connections, to pull together disparate threads into a coherent picture, but even his brilliance seemed to be tested now. The pieces were almost in place, but the final revelation, the identity of the true mastermind, remained frustratingly out of reach. We had discovered the syndicate, its connections, and even the name of the shadowy figure at its helm, but the truth still eluded us. The city, too, seemed to share in our anticipation. Streets were quieter than usual, the fog thicker, the shadows longer. It felt as though the entire world were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable climax. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were hurtling toward something far more dangerous than we had expected, and the thought made my pulse quicken. Holmes, of course, showed no sign of such uncertainty. He remained his usual composed self, though. I could tell that even he was waiting for something. He moved through the estate with purpose, gathering information, revisiting old clues, all the while keeping his focus on the true objective. We had one lead left: the identity of the mysterious figure who had orchestrated everything. The time for waiting was over. I found him in the study late that evening, his hands steepled beneath his chin as he stared intently at the documents before him. He had been reviewing Wentworth's journals, trying to make sense of the fragmented details. When I entered, he didn't look up, but his voice broke the silence. "We're close, Watson. I can feel it." I nodded, though a part of me was unsure. Every time we seemed to get closer to the truth, another door opened, revealing more questions. But I had long since learned that Holmes had an uncanny ability to see the solutions where others saw only riddles. "Do you have any idea who this figure might be?" I asked, trying to catch the edge of his thought. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Eyes were fixed on the pages in front of him, scanning them with the precision of a man who had already read and analyzed the words countless times. When he finally spoke, his tone was heavy with purpose. "I do," he said, his voice low. "But it's not enough to simply know their name. We need to know where they are, what they're planning, and how we can stop them before they make their move." My pulse quickened at his words. "So, you think we still have a chance to stop them?" Holmes looked up then, his eyes sharp and full of intent. "We must. This isn't just a case of criminal conspiracy anymore, Watson. This is a game of power, one that threatens the very fabric of society. If we don't act, the repercussions will be disastrous." The urgency in Holmes' voice was unlike anything I had heard before. It was clear that this was more than just an intellectual pursuit for him. Okay, he knew that the stakes had risen to a level beyond our control, and now time was running out. We could not afford to make another mistake. I looked down at the documents spread before him, trying to make sense of the puzzle pieces. But it was clear that Holmes had already connected the dots. He was close, so close in fact, that I could feel the tension building in my chest. We need to act tonight, Holmes said suddenly, as though reading my thoughts. Everything points to tonight. Trent's movements, the cryptic conversation we overheard, Wentworth's involvement, it all points to one location. Well, find the mastermind there, and we'll stop them. I felt a surge of adrenaline, and for the first time in days, I could see the end of this investigation, but it was not without its risks. We were walking into the heart of the enemy's domain, and I knew that once we crossed that threshold, there would be no turning back. Where do we go? I asked, my voice steady, despite the unease that was beginning to settle in my stomach. Holmes stood up from the desk, his movements quick and efficient. There is a warehouse on the outskirts of London. It's unassuming, just a place for shipping and storage. But it's a frontier place where the syndicate meets and plans their operations. Tonight, they're meeting there again. Trent will be there, and I suspect the man we're looking for will be too. I nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settle over me. We were about to step into the unknown, into the very heart of the syndicate's operations, but there was no other choice. We had come too far, and we had uncovered too much to turn back now. We left the estate quickly, the fog thickening around us as we made our way toward the warehouse. The city was eerily quiet, and the usual sounds of life seemed muffled by the mist that enveloped everything in sight. Holmes led the way, his steps confident and steady, while I followed, my mind racing with the possibilities as we approached the warehouse. I could see the faint glow of light spilling from a small window at the top of the building. Holmes paused for a moment, his hand raised in a signal for me to stop. He gestured toward the door, and I nodded, understanding his plan. We would enter quietly, gather as much information as possible, and then act when the time was right. Holmes moved swiftly, silently, his form blending into the shadows like a specter. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my chest as we reached the door. Holmes examined the lock briefly, then pulled out a small set of tools from his coat pocket. In a matter of moments, the door was open, and we slipped inside. The warehouse was dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of dust and old wood. The walls were lined with crates and barrels, most of them unlabeled and stacked high. We moved carefully through the space, avoiding the weak patches of floor that might creak under our weight. Our objective was clear. Find Trent, find the mastermind, and stop whatever operation was about to unfold. Holmes paused in the shadows, his eyes scanning the room. He was listening, I knew, for the sound of voices that would give us the clue we needed. And then, just as I was beginning to feel the weight of the waiting, I heard it, a low murmur from the far side of the warehouse. Holmes turned to me, his face a mask of concentration. "This is it," he whispered. "Stay close." We moved quietly, inching toward the source of the voices. As we neared the back of the warehouse, I could make out the outlines of several figures gathered in a circle. They were speaking in hushed tones, their words too soft for me to understand. But Holmes, ever alert, was already piecing together the scene before us. "This is it, Watson," he murmured, "the final piece." I could feel the tension building as we neared the group. The game was coming to its climax, and everything we had worked for, everything we had uncovered, was about to come to fruition. This was our moment, and then, just as we were about to make our move, one of the figures turned. The light from a nearby lantern caught his face, and I saw it, clear as day. The mastermind. The one we had been searching for all along. Sherlock Holmes and the surgeon's final stitch.